sort of sitting around now, like we can say like on the right or on the left too, and we're saying, how did we become polarized? How do we become the kind of people who think about ourselves mostly? We are kind of individualistic. How do we become the kind of people who maybe don't put neighborhoods and communities first? And the women I talked to are kind of, they weren't yelling, but like they were insistently saying, my children who grow up around other young children, they just learn these things kind of naturally.
Join the best in the movement. It's Conservative Conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953.
Welcome back. You're listening to Conservative Conversations with Marlo Slayback and Tom Saruf.
We're joined today by Catherine Pakaluk, who is professor at the Catholic University of America. She joined the faculty at the Bush School in the summer of 2016 and is the founder of the Social Research Academic Area, where she's an associate professor of social research and economic thought. Her primary areas of research include economics of education and religion, family studies and demography, Catholic social thought, and political economy. Dr. Pakaluk is the 2015 recipient of the Acton Institute's Novak Award, a prize given for significant contributions to the study of the relationship between religion and economic liberty. We are pleased to have you with us, Professor.
Thank you. Delighted to join you.
Before we begin our discussion, I'd like to thank you, the listener, for listening to Conservative Conversations. This podcast is a production of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and our mission is educating for liberty. So if you'd like to help us fulfill our mission, please be sure to rate and review this podcast to help us reach more listeners like yourself. So I want to start by just hearing a little bit more about your book, Hannah's Children, The Women Quietly Defying the Birth Dearth, which doesn't come out until March. But when you told me about this, I was like, wow, that's I feel like that can speak to so many women right now, especially, I go to a very conservative Catholic parish where I would say most of the women there are college educated, and your book is focusing specifically on that category, it sounds like. And they have large families of oftentimes 5-6 children. And so you're focusing on this 5% of women who choose to have 5 or more kids. And what I found interesting is that the 55 women you interviewed, like I said, were college educated. So what drew you specifically to this demographic of women and their stories? And what did your interviews with them reveal to you about the birth rate issue that it looks like not just the US is facing, but countries across the globe are?
Yeah, that's the big question, right? So a lot of things drew me to study this group, and which I just, previewing kind of things we'll talk about later was so much fun. I just want to say that talking to people like the ones you're describing, probably in your church, around you, like all over the country, it was really a delight. So what led me to this? Well, maybe for some of your listeners, I should unpack the word birth dearth. As it turns out that although this is a phrase I grew up with, and maybe some of your listeners did, but maybe lots of them didn't. And I was surprised to see how many people hadn't heard the term, right? So birth dearth refers to, and it was the title of a fairly successful book in the 1980s, the fact that birth rates are falling and fewer people are having, we'll say replacement size families. And so from an economic perspective, fewer than about 2 children per couple is not enough children to replace the population. And so in the 1960s and the 1970s, the popular conversation in this country and abroad was really more focused on what people thought was going to be an exploding population. So this language of the population bomb, and the bomb is a big explosion that's going to go off, and there's going to be basically famine and disease. We can talk more about that later. That has always been around. People have been worried about population explosion for a long time. It didn't begin in the 1960s. And so in the 1980s, there were a couple of kind of intrepid social researchers who said, looking at the data, it does not look like we're about to see a big population explosion. In fact, a dearth of births is probably more likely to occur. And that is, in fact, what's happened, is a birth dearth. So, so I knew that around the country, in part because I'm one of these women, but I knew that around the country, there are a lot of people who were still having larger families, in spite of the fact that the general trend has been downwards. And I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to go and find out why they look different from their contemporary peers? And, maybe more not just as a a public interest story, although I think it does have a lot of public interest, like who are these people? And I said quietly defying for a reason. These are not women sort of shaking their fists at the trend and, like, nevertheless, I'm going to have a lot of children. They're women who, for very interesting reasons, have chosen to have larger families. And I thought, well, essentially, like, really simple. We have a global phenomenon of too few births to replace the population. So there's this group of people out there. Yes, they're largely religious, but they look kind of resilient to that trend or immune from that trend. And I thought maybe there's something we can learn by checking into why they're resilient. And so we could talk later about why I picked college-educated women in particular, and that's something you asked me about. But I thought maybe I'll just stop there and see if you want to ask a follow-up.
I'm very interested. You gave a talk for a number of our students in Pittsburgh in the spring, sort of talking about this birth dearth and maybe why it's happened. And the general theme of the conference was economics in the family. So I'm wondering if you could, I guess, unpack some of because when we're talking about, sub-replacement birth rates or the breakdown in family formation, there are a lot of, especially in some corners of the right today, there's a lot of turning to an economic lens to look at that problem and to try and solve it. But how do you see those phenomena as related? And then we could probably jump more into some more of the themes of your book.
Sure. So the first thing to notice is, especially in relation to these kind of current concerns about maybe economic reasons, is that this decline in birth rates has been occurring for an awful long time. And it really, we can argue, in fact, there's a piece out right now kind of arguing that we should reinterpret the baby boom years, which are the post-war years. And I can explain that in a minute. But let's just sort of back up, take a wider view, and let's not focus on our kind of current maybe disagreements within the right about kind of what the causal factors might be. But if we back up, we think about around the time of the American founding, maybe look at like 1800, the typical family or couple would have had about 7 or 8 children. So that's a really big number compared to what we see today. And by about 1900, that number was half of that. It was about 3 to 4 per family. And then really through the 1900s, you see that number again cut itself in half. So by 2000, it's down to about 2. And so then, there's some discussion among demographers about what happens between 1900 and 2000. Is this just the steady, slow march of falling birth rates that's occurred since 1800, right? That's one way to think about this. Like, it's going down. It's going down from 1800 to 2000 to 1900, and then again, the next 100 years, they cut in half again. And so, depending on what you think is going on, that's going to affect your theory of what's going on. But that's a 200-year march downward that is pretty resistant to kind of like the ups and downs of, we could say like industrial policy or immigration or the other kinds of things that we're more concerned about in the last 20 to 30 years. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, even if we take a slightly shorter view and we think about what are the big inflection points in the 20th century, there's a kind of, I mentioned this debate about the baby boom. We sort of take it as a point of like obviousness that, people came back from the war and had all these kids. And right now there's a kind of question about whether the baby boom that we think of as kind of the post-war baby boom, was it really like kind of a post-depression baby boom that got started before the return of soldiers from the war? And so we kind of look at those inflection points. We know it really went down during the Great Depression. And that's pretty consistent. When people fall on really hard economic times, they tend to have fewer children. And so that's one of the inflection points. And so we think about like, well, what happens after the Depression? Okay, you have the war. There's certainly, whether we time that rebound of birth rates with the war or right before it with the end of the Depression, either way, birth rates look like they're kind of rebounding for a little while there. But then you hit 1960. And 1960, for a lot of reasons, it's this kind of watershed year where things really start to change. And so in terms of birth rates, that's kind of the beginning of a very big slide downwards. And that's really when the slide to what we would call now below replacement fertility starts in the 1960s. And then it really is accomplished into the 1970s. So people today, I think, are not aware that for native-born women in this country, below replacement fertility has been pretty much the norm since the 1970s. This isn't recent. And the only reason the United States looked different from, many other Western countries for, at least certainly up until 2000, when immigration sort of slowed down, the only reason we looked really different is because of immigration. And we had this kind of tendency not to sort of isolate out native-born women from immigrants. And that was a mistake. We should have focused on the behavior of native-born women. Why? Because immigrants' birth rates tend to converge to the native rates very quickly. They don't come and then just continue with the birth rates that they had back in their home countries. And that's another feature of modern demographics, which is very interesting. There aren't enormous places in the world where people are still having very large families. So so those are some of the features I think that you asked about, the sort of various causes. There's a lot of things we could talk about. I mean, obviously, if we really had this figured out, if scholars really knew kind of this is the reason why birth rates are falling, it wouldn't have been so easy to dive into this project. So one of the reasons I dove into it is to try to learn some new things about it.
So before I ask the question of why college-educated women, I want to ask about what you think and maybe these are observations you've made throughout your career, maybe there were ones you specifically made while focusing on that category of college-educated women who are choosing to have 5 or more kids. Is there something that I'm sure it's, it's a cocktail of different things. Like it could be maybe some of it's policy, but just my own observations. And, I'm not an economist, so this is not, authoritative at all. Just my observations as a woman, myself and a mother, talking to other women who are also mothers, is a lot of people just don't want to have a lot of children. And there are, types of barriers to that, whether it's like they have the expectations of wanting a larger home, or there's other constraints, and there's these expectations that certainly weren't the norm when our parents were growing up or when our parents' parents were growing up. And perhaps that's kind of had a prohibitive, this idea that, every child has to have, the vacations, and I think that's the vacations, the private schooling, all doing all the activities. That's something I've observed from talking to friends of mine who aren't, in kind of the social conservative and don't follow the same faith tradition as I do. So I'm almost like, I appreciate and can see the reason and the kind of the why someone would want to put in place some sort of policy that might incentivize people to have more kids. But my on the ground observations just have not really lined up with that reality. Like, quite frankly, I'm not sure that would be a good incentive for a lot of people. Because they point to, and I'm sure you've heard this a million times, like, well, what would I do? Like with children, I have like a ton of student loans to pay back, right? Or I'm not in a place in my life right now where I could afford children. And this is largely coming from millennials and Gen Z. That's at least where I'm hearing this. So what would you respond to that? Like, maybe we don't need to get into the nitty gritty and the granular details of the policy, but from your observations from solely talking to people and then putting on, your hat as an economist, what do you think is really the root issue here?
Yeah. So, okay, I just love that you raised this question. It's a great question. It was, in a sense, one of the motivating questions for this research. Yeah, I just want to say, first of all, since we're having a conversation, I actually think people's observations on the ground, whatever you're taking away from your conversations with people, are really, really helpful and the kind of thing that needs to come to this conversation. So you don't discount your observations. They really line up with a lot of the things that I heard. So I think once we kind of fully unpack what we think is going on here, and there's a couple of things we can hit on before we're done. Yeah, my conclusion from talking to the women that I talked to was that policy efforts to sort of incentivize more births are likely to fail. I mean, look, as a point of historical fact, remember I said that birth rates have been low, like below replacement since the 70s, and not just in the United States, but other countries reached that place before we did. Lots and lots of countries. We should not have collective ignorance. Dozens of countries have experimented with very impressive types of pronatalist and pro-family policies for the sake of getting the birth rate up. And they've never worked. They don't work anywhere. They have never worked. And so the kind of current excitement about, oh, well, if we just redistribute more or send people bigger checks or pay off their student loans, you hear that, it'll get people to that. The assumption baked in is that, that there's all these people out there that are ready to have their first or second or third kid, but for that student loan payment or but for that car payment or whatever that is. In other words, it's a picture of people who are sort of like at the limit of their budget constraint and who really want that next child. Now, wanting that next child is something that we also debate as scholars. We kind of debate like what it means to want children. When people say that they think 3 children is an ideal family size, do they mean that in the same way that I might say like driving a really nice Mercedes-Benz would be ideal, but I don't really think I'll ever have it, right? Like, and so if you did a big survey and you found out people had ideal family sizes that they couldn't achieve, which is what we see, is that different from saying, oh, people like to have, cars and boats and vacations that they can't have too? And in other words, like, it's not the biggest deal. If they really did want those things, they would figure out a way to have them. Your question, I think you packed in this thing about kind of like a sense of lifestyle of like the whole set of things that we think make up a kind of a good and a balanced life for women today and for couples and families. So I heard a lot about that, and I think that is exactly the kind of thing that's going on. So I guess I'll just sort of front load like kind of the key thing that I heard when I talked to people, which was that the real cost of having a child is, yes, I mean, there's this like set of financial expenses, we could say outlays, things that like, oh, if I have this child, I might have to pay for this or that. But that the real cost is, well, let's just like be economic here. It's what you have to give up to get a child, right? And so there's some money you have to give up to have a child. And we can think about different contexts depending on the kind of insurance you have or the schooling that you might want to pick for your social status or whatever. But what you have to give up to have a child also includes a whole bunch of these lifestyle goods, which are now quite common. It includes a certain amount of free time. It includes probably, depending on who you are, probably giving up a certain trajectory in your career, right? So it's not like women who have a lot of children or even like 2 or 3 children can't have a job or a career, but they probably have to adjust the trajectory of their careers, right? I mean, time is just what it is. So there's this so what do you have to give up to have a child is going to include all those things, the vacations, the cars, the lifestyle, the size of a home, the neighborhood you can access, the second income or a certain size of a second income. That's like altogether the cost, right? And so there's no policy way to fix that piece, right? That can't be incentivized. You can make the money expenditures lower, right? And we can argue about that too, but actually I think you can't really make the money expenditures meaningfully lower, right? You can, no country on earth has enough money to sort of, let's say, compensate for the loss of a second income, right? That's a very big number, right? If you're looking at a couple that basically thinks they can kind of keep their 2 incomes going if they have their second or third child or their first child, and it's just going to be kind of like paying for daycare or something like that. Maybe that couple, if you could give them $500 a month, maybe it's going to kind of make a difference, make it easier. But really, like the real financial burden is it's this like loss of a second income or a bigger second income. Nobody even can talk about a policy that big. And if we could, we definitely couldn't afford it. But yeah, like even if that was sort of more important than it is, really what you have to give up is this whole, right? So like the second income, especially for these college educated women, it's not just the money, right? It's the status, it's the who you are, it's like your identity in the world, right? you're just a mom, or you're just whatever that is, like that whole conversation, that's kind of what you have to give up. And, you can kind of have like one kid and hang on to all that, maybe two, but not five, right? If you have five, you are definitely declaring like, that's not, this is this other thing that I'm doing. So the women in my study used the language of like a shift in identity, that if you continue having children after the first or the second, there's this is their language, the language of a shift. Like a shift happens, and then motherhood becomes this kind of deep part of who you are. So, you might have thought of yourself like, oh, I'm an economist, or, oh, I'm a doctor or something. But then, with the second or the third, there's a point. It doesn't happen immediately. There's a point where you kind of settle into this, like, oh, I'm a mom. Like I'm a mother. That's a really deep part of who I am. And it kind of shapes everything else, starts to shape like the kind of professional that you are, the kind of person that you are in the world. People see you that way. And that like undertaking that shift is something that I think is scary. Like you're in a world where people aren't doing this very often. It's a really big shift. It's a lot more safe to kind of take on motherhood. Like it's one of the many things that you do, right? And so like you can balance motherhood and work and motherhood and another life, like up to a point, but past 2 or 3 kids, you're in it, right? There's no way to like corral it into a little piece of your life. So maybe that was too much, but that's kind of what you were asking about. So yeah, the policies aren't going to work.
I just have a follow-up to that, because I think that's a great point about there is this tendency to compartmentalize and, our different roles, especially when you don't have children. You're able to say like, I work at, I don't know, like, let's say you work at like Wells Fargo or some bank. And then, so that's maybe that's your job during the week. And then on weekends, you're, a friend, and you have a very, you have yoga at this time. And I don't mean to like, stereotype like what, women without children do, but this is just my impression from hanging out on social media myself as someone who is of the social media generation. But something I'm learning with motherhood is you can't really do that anymore. And, I have a 1-year-old, so I'm new to it, but like you are a mother, and that kind of trumps everything else. And I think that's a very hard hurdle to come across at one child. Mm-hmm. And I've heard it kind of gets easier, once the second comes around, because you've gone the like really steep obstacle of that lifestyle shift you talk about. You more or less have had to reconcile that. But once you get closer to that, that 5 benchmark and on, just for the sake of time, the time that you have is finite, and you can't make yourself you can't compartmentalize that many ways, right? Like it's motherhood. That's what you are. And there's no shame in that, obviously. In fact, it's, it's the backbone of our civilization, of our, of the world is motherhood, of a healthy one at least. So what would you say to just, your observations, talking to these women, being a mother yourself of, like you said, of 5+ children? How is that? I'm sure this is probably going to be helpful for the young women listening who oftentimes people don't tell them, it does involve sacrifice, but sacrifice isn't a bad thing. But also there's redemptive aspects, and the popular culture is working against those, right? So what would you say about that?
Yeah. So I think that everything you just described is so spot on. It's really correct. I think there's a lot of ignorance around what it looks like to have more than one child or more than 2. First of all, remember that most young women today, college women, women in their 20s or 30s, they didn't grow up with babies. Why? Because if you grew up in a family of 2 or 3 children, you don't remember a baby. The last time your mom had a baby, you were, 2, if at all, or you were the baby, right? Right. But if you are in a family of 5+, if you're on the upper end, you would have grown up around babies and children. And this is one of the consequences, and one of the reasons why I think falling birth rates tend to accelerate themselves, Because what happens is people who grow up in very small families grow up with a profound, it's not their fault, but it's a profound ignorance about what it looks like to make that shift, like what you're talking about. And so one of the truths is, yeah, that first baby is like getting hit by a truck initially, and you think your life is over and you could never kind of integrate what it means to be constantly paying attention to that baby. You could never integrate that with who you used to be. And you think it is really this like, and one of the things I was trying to get out from my interviewees was kind of like, how does that work out? Do you lose the old self? Does the old self like live again? Like, how does this work out? But to the young women that might be listening, one problem that we have is people dive in, maybe idealistically, they have that first child, they feel like they've been hit by a truck and they think, I couldn't do that a second time. But the second time, it's not as bad. And the third time, it's like, well, I'm getting good at this point, right? And the women that I talked to who have 5 or more children, I found, I had a lot of interesting stories about that. I mean, one woman who I named Leah in the book, I mean, she says, it's so sad that people stop at 1 or 2. She says, like, you've done all the hard work at that point. Like, it's just benefits after that. And so she had a nice discussion about that. And, even too related to like the cost, like you have all the stuff, you have the gear, all the like sort of outlays. Why would you, stop at that point? So yeah, it does get easier, right? And as you said, it does get easier. But I also think when you ask the question, you kind of referred to like the social media generation. And I'm sort of like a little bit past, I mean, I didn't grow up with that. We'll say that. I'm dimly aware of Shakshuka Girl and that whole discussion that just occurred like last week.
That's exactly who I had in mind was Shakshuka Girl. Yeah.
Yeah. I sort of feel sorry. I should know her name. I don't really know her name. And I didn't comment online because, I'm not in that world. I don't want to. But like, basically your heart goes out, right? I mean, she doesn't know. And you were sort of like, well, I don't know, like, what would it be like on the weekend if you don't have kids? And, what was interesting was how many different funny responses there were to her. Some popular accounts were saying things like, actually, like, I've got kids and I still wake up in the morning and decide to like learn new recipes. Like, why does she think that somehow you can't do those things anymore, right? I mean, so like my kids are, I have a lot of kids and half of them are in college or beyond. And then the other half are still in my house, but like, I don't have babies anymore. So I'm kind of obsessed with cooking. So I thought like, what's the big issue? So a lot of people said, well, she just doesn't know. She just doesn't know that once you have kids, you can still do those things. On the other hand, yeah, it would be wrong to say that kind of like when you come home from the hospital with that first baby, that like you've got it figured out and you're Googling recipes with your, like other spare hand, you've got a baby on the hip and the recipe and on the other side. It takes a little time to do that. And that really brings up something that one of my other moms talked a lot about. Her name was Danielle. And she said, we've really lost this idea that mothering is a skill. It's a skill. It's something that you can spend years getting good at it. And she said, we think more like it's like caregiving is something that we should just be able to do the same way that we think, well, anybody can get in a car and drive to the grocery store. Anybody can get in a car and go take care of somebody. She really meant it in a broad sense, like not just care for our children, but care for the old, the infirm, the sick. But caregiving is a skill, right? It's something we get better at. And the truth is, like when you have your first baby, if you try to, work a part-time job or like make shakshuka like too quickly, you definitely can kind of like low impact, like neglect your child or, screw up the thing you're trying to do because you're just not that good at it. But the amazing thing is you do get better at it if you spend deliberate time learning how to be good at it. And so people often say to me, it's one of the most common questions I get from, young women on the road, like, well, you look like you're doing it all. And I say, yeah, but I didn't start teaching college until after I had my 6th baby. And that's a little bit of one of those like depressing it's sort of a mic drop, but also a little bit depressing, I think, to people. Because they want to believe that what it's going to look like is like there's some secret formula and you can have all these children and still do a career. Like you have to be really patient. So I like the way I did it. Like I had my kids when I was younger and then really kind of spent more time developing my professional portfolio like later in life, which is, I think, really humane from the perspective of kind of biological fertility and like the way we like to build our families, I think. But yeah, man, like I remember it was really hard to learn how to teach with a nursing baby, but that was my 6th baby. I was not learning how to keep him alive. You have your first, you are learning how to keep your baby alive and then happy. And, so it's really true. Like learning one thing at a time is much easier, right? So like I always tell young women, like, man, I didn't learn to cook till way after I had kids. And if I had extra time before I got married, like do it now, like learn how to cook now, because I had to sort of learn like when there were babies crawling around, and it took me a lot longer. So your questions are good ones. Yeah.
Well, I also hear from my friends who have several children is you can deputize the older ones to help with the younger ones. Yeah. And I like that approach as someone with a very rambunctious child and who's a boy and just has like so much energy. And that was when I was like, I felt like I was hit by a truck whenever I had my first, because it was a major, as someone who I'm a conservative Catholic. Like my mom comes from a family of 11 children. My dad's 6. So like, that's not foreign to me, but, it was still, I sympathize. And, but yeah, no, I've heard, there are different ways to work around it, where the more children you have, you're able to keep your child entertained because they have siblings, and, they're able to kind of like deflect off of each other. So, I have to remember that every time that I think like, is this just going to be, if I have more kids, is it going to be like, having first baby over and over again? And you're totally right. I think, is caretaking is a skill, which is why it's, it's so expensive to hire childcare, is because it's hard to be a good caregiver and it takes practice. Yeah. But Tom,
I definitely don't.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, I don't think it should be cheap. Like you want somebody good enough to do what you're doing. They should probably cost as much as you cost. I mean, right? This is sort of like the fundamental. Daycare is not really, or childcare, it's not really feasible if we want it to replace us, right? If it's going to replace us, it should cost as much as we cost.
Right.
In which case, like you decide, is it worth it to you? Right? And some people will decide it's worth it to them. Like what they do, like, I don't know, they're saving lives left and right. They're a cancer surgeon. I don't know. Vivek Ramaswamy talked on the Jordan Peterson podcast about his wife, who is a surgeon and saves a lot of lives. And it sounds very heroic, but she's little ones. And that's a call that she's made because her work is, they've decided, incredibly meaningful. And they could probably afford to replace her with someone of high quality. And, so, I mean, those are really tough. But we should at least admit, like, if you want to replace yourself, your caregiver should cost as much as you cost. Like, that's basically the point. That's a first point. But then you also said something about like, when you have more children, you can kind of deputize older children. And there are so many great stories about that in the book that are going to be fun to just sort of to read a little bit. But, my sister is about to have her second and she's shopping for a new car. And I said, well, do the thing where you get in the car with the car seats and like buckle them all in, because that's a great way to know if the car is going to be a good car for a family. But then I also said to her, but, the funny thing is, after I think I had my 3rd or my 4th, I don't think I buckled a kid into a car seat ever again after that. Because, your oldest kid is like, oh, Mom, I got it. And they crawl in there and they buckle the kid in and they like, and then it's like the remote control on the TV, which I cannot use. I don't know how to use it. I don't know how to get I'm like, where do I find Hulu? I don't know where to find it on my TV. But why? Because the kids have been doing it for me for the last decade, right? And with the car seats, it was the same. Like the car seats get really complicated and you're like, oh, the kid has got it all figured out. No, I'm not saying you don't double check like the kid is actually buckled in, but you can have a competent 10-year-old who is like, Mom, like they're better at figuring out where everything clicks than you are. And that just, repeat that is very, very common. So it's not even that you have to deputize or motivate them to do this. They actually, from a young age, take a lot of pleasure in helping. But what are they taking pleasure in? They're taking pleasure in being like you. They want to participate in what you're doing, right? Like when you're mixing up the brownie batter. I mean, I don't know if your little one is old enough yet. Maybe not. It's still a baby. But when you have like a 3 or 4-year-old, they want to climb up on the counter and like mix the brownie batter with you, right? And you're like, get out. You're going to make a mess. I don't want to bake with my 3-year-old, right? That's your first instinct. But the instinct of a child to want to imitate the meaningful work that the parent does, right? That's sort of the philosophy behind the Montessori education method is kind of what young people want to do by nature is imitate the meaningful work of adults. Right. And so our whole idea is like we want to entertain children and we want to turn education into entertainment. And Montessori said, no, that's crazy. If you just observe young children and you watch what they do, they like a moth to a flame, they find adults doing work in the world and they want to join in. Like, can I help you sweep? Can I help? Right. That's what if you just let them unadulterated, what do they want to do? This is probably, well, I don't know if you remember this from other people, certainly when we have a repair person into our house to fix anything, my kids are all like awkwardly gathering around, like, can I watch the repair person? And you're like, oh, I'm so sorry. Like there's like an audience here to watch you fix this thing. But here's my real point is that when you have younger children in the home around a small child, a child who's 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, what is the child seeing you doing? What is your meaningful work? Oh, here's the spoon. You are feeding the baby. You're like, oh, come here, little one. Like, open up, helicopter the food into the mouth. What's happening? Your 5-year-old is watching this. It's meaningful work. And your 5-year-old is like, oh, can I do it? Can I feed the baby? Can I put the baby down? Can I change the diaper? You don't have to make them do this. It's actually kind of amazing. But then think about like what we're missing out on, right? So there's like a lifetime of training if a 5-year-old grows up with a little one, 3 or 4 years, like a lifetime, a whole, like all the way from when they're 5, when their little sibling is born, all the way to when they're 18, they leave for college. They have watched that kid go through all the ages. They participated. They wanted to participate in meaningful work. And then they take that whole like set of skills and knowledge into their adult lives. That was described by so many people I talked to. And it was like this huge wow. It was like, what are we missing in society when most people don't experience that? So it's not hard to deputize them. They want to do it. And so that's an amazing thing. So we're sort of sitting around now, like we can say like on the right, or I mean, on the left too. And we're saying, how did we become polarized? How do we become the kind of people who think about ourselves mostly? We are kind of individualistic. How do we become the kind of people who maybe don't put neighborhoods and communities first? And the women I talked to are kind of, I mean, they weren't yelling, but like they were insistently saying, my children who grow up around other young children, they just learn these things kind of naturally. It's not that you can't learn it another way, but they insisted that their children had like an advantage, like they'd kind of grown up with something that you'd like to teach everybody, right? So that was really shocking and really interesting to hear. And there are a lot of different ways people talked about that. So yeah, this is back to your point, 100% it gets easier. And yeah, when your oldest one is a little older, they will naturally want to help with the younger ones.
I had a question, but instead I want to ask something else because we're coming to the end. So I think this will probably be a good ending question. Given the women that you interviewed, they are, I guess, outliers in a sense. That's only 5%. That's no small number, but it is, I guess, an exception to a larger trend. But when you think about long-term demographic trends, especially as, I don't want to just generalize it and say the left isn't having kids, but you do hear about the sort of trope of the childless left. And I think there is a fair bit of truth to it. And also if you look at, for instance, people who don't go to church are far less likely to have children. Again, you can ask, correlation, causation. I saw some research recently that is making a causal argument for like the decline of religiosity is correlated, or is actually causes declines in childbirth. But I guess when you're looking at long-term demographic trends, when you have a small but significant contingent of the population that are passing on this, not only the actual lifestyle of having large families, but all of the habits, opinions, and virtues that go along with that. I wonder, I guess, if we're looking at far out into the future of the country, maybe what we're looking at right now is sub-replacement birth rates that is a cause for alarm, but maybe in the long-term future, that's that won't be the case. We'll have a resurgence of large families that will sort of, I guess, retake over as they're the ones, if be fruitful multiplies the injunction and you have a bunch of people not doing that, their kids who do not exist won't be around to see that. So I'm wondering, you're a social researcher, a social scientist, among other things. Maybe that doesn't bode well for predictions into the future, but I'm wondering, I guess, what you see for the future of the country, the future of the West in general.
Yeah. So, well, I mean, you're not wrong. I mean, the hackneyed phrase, we say demography is destiny, right? Yeah, I think if we, so interesting thing, I want to try to stick to the data that I have in front of me. A lot of people asked, well, are the people in the people that you met, are they people who all kind of grew up with big families, right? So I did, and Marlo, I don't know if you did, but you sounded like maybe your parents or grandparents did. But actually, interestingly, in my data, less than half of the women I talked to grew up in big families. So how did the other half end up doing what they're doing? They had some kind of religious conversion. Yeah, like something happened, right? So that was quite interesting to me. And, I know it's like 60-40 or maybe it's like 55-45. So like over 50% of the people that I talked to were people who didn't kind of always know that they wanted to have 4 or 5 kids. So that's good news from the perspective that, number one, you don't have to be this person like raised in this weird way, like on a, I won't use a stereotype, but you don't have to be this person raised in an awkward way or an outlier way to kind of grow up and be an outlier. A lot of people arrived at this through a kind of recognition, through a religious conversion, that this is a good and beautiful way to live and like something you should intentionally choose. A lot of people. So that was amazing. So number one, that people could become this way, even if they don't grow up this way. Number two, yes. So I don't have the number off the top of my head, but these are 5% of women, and it's a cross section. I'm using this number. I mean, the best way to think about fertility is kind of like women of a certain age, like, right, that's the birth cohort, maybe a band of like about 5 years, women 45 to 50 today. That's my band. Women 40 to 44. Now we like to look at those bands because these are women who've mostly completed their fertility. It tells you something. So if we look at the 20-year-olds, you could probably find some 25-year-olds that have, well, maybe not 5 kids, but 3 or 4, but we don't know where they're going yet. So we look at these 40-year-old rates, and it's about 5% for both the 45 to 50 band and also the 40 to 44-year-old band right now. So 5% is a pretty big number. It's bigger than I think most people realize. Each of those bands currently accounts for about 500,000 women, right? So that's like 1 million just in their 40s who have 5 or more children. And now here's the statistic I was going to mention, which I don't have off the top of my head. But the 5% of women in that group will count for much more than 5% of the children in that group. So probably closer to 10 or 15% of the children being raised by women of that same age, right? So that's kind of like the natural consequence of this 5% with these really large families. So yeah, a couple things. If children who grow up in large, generously sized, we'll say, homes, if they're more likely to kind of think that's a great way to live and to do that. We don't know for sure, but we think there's something there. Then I think you're right that that's what we can expect to see in the future. The question is kind of how long it would take that demographic shift to sort of play itself out. Because I mean, I don't know if you remember this, but back around the year 2000, the first time we had some of these really hairline, elections, there were people kind of optimistically saying, oh, the future is going to be red, because basically everyone's going to vote red from now on because these are the people having the babies. So I actually talk about that in one of the first chapters of the book. I say, remember this. So they're not wrong. We do see when we look at like the demographics of counties by voting that yes, people who get married younger, people who are more religious, and people who have more children do tend to vote for Republicans, at least in the last 30 to 40 years. That pattern has become a lot more pronounced since 1990 and into 2000. So to put it mildly, like these are people with younger marriages and more children are Republican voters in general. So you're not totally wrong there when you say that there's some divide there. And people like, ranging from people like Charles Murray talking about coming apart to now today, like, some of the newer research, people like Brad Wilcox, Melissa Kearney's new book, Two-Parent Privilege. We do see over and over and over that how you choose to live your family life, both the family that you experienced growing up and the family that you choose as an adult, is correlated profoundly with your sort of voting habits and your political values. I said correlated with very intentionally to be really careful because we don't really understand the causality, but I definitely think there's a strong case to be made for the causality going from sort of family pattern to voting patterns and not the other way around. You can kind of make the argument from time, like so that the family patterns precede the voting patterns to some extent, but bigger argument has to be made. So yeah, I think it's there. I think it will emerge, but we will probably go through a whole bunch of political cataclysms first. and why do I say that? Because basically the country will be bankrupt very, very shortly. We're like on the brink of bankruptcy right now. And so the political cataclysms will come about because of all the various social programs that we'll have to reevaluate. And right, like bankruptcy tends to cause all kinds of problems. And why do I mention bankruptcy in connection with childbearing? Well, because this is one of the main reasons we're bankrupt. It's not the only reason, but it's one of the main reasons. Not because the children are bringing in money, right? But because we built a political order on the assumption of a constantly growing population, and which turned out not to be true, right? We sort of baked those post-war baby boom birth rates into our expectations for the future, and we purchased a bunch of social programs we probably couldn't afford. So yeah.
Well, I feel like we could talk forever, and I'm really excited for your book to come out. So perhaps, readers, if you are interested in more of what Dr. Pakaluk has to say about this topic, then definitely check that out on March 19th is the publication date. Is that right?
That's right.
Great.
Yeah,
and we'll include that in the show notes. So if people are interested in reading more of your work or following you, where can they find you, whether that's on social media or elsewhere?
Yeah. So I have a very modest Twitter presence or X presence at CR Pakaluk. And I'm modestly on Facebook as well. The website is forthcoming. We'll say that. But yeah, I'm usually in and out of Twitter, X. I'll probably try to grow that a little bit over time. So.
Well, thank you again so much, Catherine, for joining us.
You're welcome, Marlo and Tom. It was really a pleasure. These kinds of conversations are so good and so good for us to have, and obviously for our listeners. But really, it's a privilege. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, and hopefully this was helpful for our students and our listeners and young people listening. And thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please be sure to head to our website at isi.org/resources to see all that we offer our members, which includes the Intercollegiate Review, select modern age articles, and of course, this podcast. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to rate and review, and we'll see you next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI.